This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC Podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything, from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 234 of the GardenDC Podcast. In this episode, we talk with Dr. Mark DeBard, board member of the International Lilac Society, all about lilacs. The plant profile is on Trout lily, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on the lilac and Nosferatu, symbolism of lilacs and death. This episode, we're joined by Dr. Mark DeBard. He is a board member on the International Lilac Society. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Kathy. Good to be here.
Great to have you, and we're going to talk about all things lilacs, and the springtime is coming up, and I can almost smell them. Almost.
They're starting to get those leaves showing their green.
But before we dive into all of that, we like to ask our guests here on the GardenDC Podcast, were they born with chlorophyll in their veins and a green thumb?
Absolutely not for me. I was into medicine early on. I became an emergency physician, but there are lots of doctors who are into gardening as a hobby. Primarily, I suppose, to relieve stress in their professional lives. But, they're also scientists, lifelong students, lifelong teachers, and that's what people do in horticulture as well. So doctors have a long tradition of being involved in gardening. You can go all the way back to, say, Edward Jenner in England, the inventor of the smallpox vaccine, who was very much into roses and orchids. And there's a long line of famous physicians and other professionals who've been very interested in gardening. So I really got into it as a hobby, one of many hobbies that I had. I was a gemologist for a while. I did astronomy. Then I got into vegetable gardening and roses early on. Loved the fragrance of roses. I even planted a 100-tree fruit orchard at one time. Unfortunately, I didn't get to keep that land. And then in 1996, I was on a refreshing vacation in Mackinac Island, one of my favorite places. And there I ran across a meeting of the International Lilac Society. And I found somebody there who mentored me a little bit, took me to their auction, and that kind of hooked me. But my professional life really didn't allow time for it until I got close to retiring in 2015. And that's when I realized I could build a lilac garden in my inaccessible backyard now that I'm going to have time in retirement. And that's when I started getting into lilacs in greater detail.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad that you dispelled the myth that all doctors do in their off time is golf.
Oh, no, I'm afraid I'd be a total duffer at that.
And glad to hear that so many physicians are into gardening as well. And I think that makes sense. As you say, there's a lot of scientific correlations behind it. And of course, the stress relief of gardening does play into that a lot.
It does.
So let's tell our listeners a little bit about where you garden and where you have that lilac collection.
Well, I have a very small yard, actually, about a little more than a half an acre, but I also have some adjacent city property that's unused and inaccessible, primarily because it's a giant hill going down to a ravine. So I kind of appropriated that as well. And the hill was covered in Canadian thistle when I bought this home about 14 years ago. So I just decided I needed to get rid of that thistle, plant some grass, tried some crown vetch as well, and measured out 7 or 8 foot intervals, which, by the way, is too close for lilacs. And planted what today is 180 different cultivars of lilacs on the steep hills on my backyard.
Wow, ambitious. And could you describe a little bit about where your closest city is, where you're located, especially for those listeners outside the United States, and maybe a little bit about your growing conditions, like zone, soil, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Well, I'm in central Ohio, specifically a northern suburb of Columbus, Ohio. We're officially now zone 6B with the new update to the USDA zones. And that means we get down to a max of -5 degrees Fahrenheit in the wintertime. I think we actually hit -8 one night this past winter.
Mm.
But 6B, and that means we're starting to leaf out a few of the early shrubs at this point in time. The soil around here, as in most of Ohio, except for the northeast corner, is pretty neutral to alkaline and tends to be on the clay to loamy side. If you go up into the Cleveland, Akron area, you'll be getting into more sandy, acid soil, which is why azaleas and rhododendrons and blue hydrangeas grow so well up there, but certainly not in central Ohio.
And I think a lot of people in the horticultural industry are familiar with the Columbus area just because that's where Cultivate, one of the biggest trade shows, takes place every summer.
Yes, we're always pleased to have that hosted here every year. And I volunteer at Chadwick Arboretum, where they usually do a tour of the annual cultivar trials at the Ohio State University campus as well.
So you mentioned before we started the recording that you're also a volunteer master gardener.
I am. Well, I was only doing lilacs for some years there, and then I decided I really need to expand my knowledge of horticulture a lot more. So in 2020, I took the Master Gardener Volunteer course from Ohio State. We did it all winter long. We finished up just as the pandemic was beginning, and we were still able to complete our internships that summer and eventually become certified as Master Gardener volunteers.
And we mentioned you stumbled across the International Lilac Society when you were on your Michigan vacation, and now you're a board member, and is it recording secretary?
Membership secretary.
Membership secretaries.
Yeah, we run a Facebook page as well for the ILS, which I am one of the moderators and administrators for that. And we have a lot of activities going on. So I've been very involved in that. I contribute to a lot of published articles in our journal, and it's been a great teaching vehicle. I've met a lot of people very knowledgeable about lilacs over the years. Some professionals in the organization as well who've been very kind to share their knowledge with me.
Excellent. And we should, of course, note that you also are the registrar of all new lilacs.
I am. I was very lucky to have that interest. I'm, a scientist, and I could have probably been a curator of some kind of lilacs. But I was tutored by a Canadian who taught me how to do the job while he was still alive, and that was Freek Vrookman. And when he died, I was probably the only one around who was qualified to carry on his tradition, and I took over the registrar for lilacs for the entire world at that time. We have probably 3,000 entries in it, and there's probably about 1,800 lilac cultivars still living in the world right now.
And I think we'll get into a few of those, maybe not all 1,800.
Hopefully not.
No, but we'll get into that. So let's start with the basics. Why lilacs? Why are they so popular, do you think?
So probably it's related to things like roses and orchids as well. Number one, they are gorgeous. The cool thing about them is they have these giant panicles with lots of little florets. The florets really only have 4 petals each, but together they're beautiful, striking to the eye. But they are also two-toned almost all the time. That is, the buds are a darker color and the flowers are a lighter color, and they develop from the bottom up to the tip in order. They don't all come out at once. So there's really 2 colors present at all times, and that adds to the great beauty they have. They can also be covering the entire bush and just look like one mass of flowers. So it depends a little bit on the species for that. Then, of course, everybody knows it's the fragrance, and that's why they've been popular in Europe and in the U.S. for many, many decades and centuries, for that matter. It used to be used to cover up other odors, and today, of course, they're used to enhance our natural environment. They're great for pollinators as well. They're visited constantly by all types of insects that like to pollinate plants. They have lots of pollen to contribute themselves. So I think those are the big factors. And plus, they reward patience, and people that are patient and like to see things evolve slowly, they'll reward that as well. They're certainly not an instant gratification flower or shrub.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it also has to do with nostalgia and memory. Like that was the shrub in your grandmother's garden, or you remember that scent from an occasion. And of course, they usually bloom at the height of spring. So that brings those memories back as well.
You're absolutely right. Everybody tends to have a memory of a beautiful lilac in their grandparents' yard, and they tend to want to replant one themselves. But there's a lot more to learn about lilacs than your grandmother's common lilac.
And so there are 4 main types of lilacs?
Well, yes, if we learn nothing else today, I want to tell you that there are 4 main types of lilacs and how to extend your growing season by knowing what those are. So everybody's familiar with grandma's common lilac, and we'll call that the first type, the common lilac. That is about the first lilac to bloom, and that will be coming out around the 1st of May and peaks in most places around Mother's Day in mid-May, depending on what zone you're in. Then there's a second type that blooms right as the common lilac's starting to finish, and most people will call that the little leaf lilac, for reasons, of course, that it has a much smaller leaf than the common lilac. The actual series name is the pubescentes, but you don't have to know that. We can call them little leaf. And then as those are getting ready to stop blooming, there are the late lilacs. And the late lilacs have similar colors and size to their panicles as the common lilacs, and they last for another couple of weeks as well. And then finally, when those are all done, there are the tree lilacs, which is quite different. They really only come in white and occasionally yellow in terms of their flower color, but they're single-stem trees. And today you'll see lots of them planted everywhere you go, particularly in newer suburbs, because they only grow to about 30 feet. They don't get into wires too much. They are fragrant, though not nearly as much as the more common lilacs are. And so it's a succession of lilacs that if you plant them properly together, you can have 8 weeks of bloom.
I think that for us in the Mid-Atlantic, the tree lilac is not as common as I see in the Midwest and the upper Midwest. And I always thought that was just them pruning them that way. So I didn't realize it was a separate variety or family.
It definitely is. And it's very hardy and adaptable to cities. There's one cultivar of it called ivory silk that seems to be the predominant one planted everywhere, and it is very common here in the Midwest.
And all these 4 varieties are not native to the United States, correct?
There are no native lilacs to North America.
Maybe we can go into some of the background of where those lilacs come from.
Sure. Almost all lilacs come from East Asia, with 2 exceptions. One of them is the common lilac, Syringa vulgaris, that everybody knows and loves. And that's the one that we have all the named cultivars for the most. It's the biggest, grows up to 15, 20 feet easily, although there are more compact varieties nowadays. It's the one with the most colors out there. There's 7 recognized colors of lilacs. It's the one with probably the best fragrance, and it does have several different species in it besides the common Syringa vulgaris. And one of them we'll need to talk about because it might be important to learn about in warming areas such as Washington, D.C. So that would be the first one. So yes, so the common lilac actually originated in Eastern Europe, over in the Romania, Hungary, Georgia area in the Carpathian Mountains over there. And then there's a second lilac which belongs to the late lilacs called Syringa josephaea. It's the only endangered lilac in the world, and it's endangered because its native lands in Eastern Europe have been developed and it's starting to die out over there. But that lilac is available in this country. There's a few cultivars of it. I have a couple of them in my backyard, and it has similar blooms, but more restricted colors and a mildly different fragrance, often described as spicy. Few people don't seem to like it, but most of us do. So the rest of them, all the others that we've talked about and will talk about, all come from Eastern Asia, and they grow in very similar temperate climate to what we have here in the northern and eastern United States.
And so one thing that lilacs all have in common pretty much is that they need that winter or cold exposure to set bloom. Is that correct?
That is true. So you could probably grow lilacs in zones 9 and 10, but you generally will not be able to get them to bloom unless you have about 2 weeks of temperatures in the east is what you need. Now, I know of one place where they grow and bloom that's rated zone 9, and that's at Descanso Gardens outside of Los Angeles around Pasadena. But they are up a couple of thousand feet in the mountains, and they get some cooling at night, which is just enough to let them set flowers and bloom. But in general, zone 8 is about the farthest south that you're going to be able to get them to bloom, but they're very hardy, especially the common lilac. They'll go up to zone 3 pretty easily. Minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and centigrade, for that matter, is not a problem for most of them.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why they are such an old-fashioned favorite is their hardiness. They could be pruned back pretty hard if you want to, and they put up with a lot of abuse.
They really do, and that's what made them easy for immigrants to bring them on ships crossing the ocean in the 1700s. They've been in the United States with the first immigrants.
And let's talk a little bit about that variety that you said might do better for us here in the Washington, D.C. area, that it might put up with more heat.
So let's talk about that. There are many different species of common lilacs. The vulgaris is the one that everybody knows and loves. There's one other that starts blooming about a week before vulgaris called oblata, and that only comes from China. But we have oblata in the United States and Canada as well. And if you take oblata and cross it with vulgaris, you get a special cross hybrid called Hyacinthiflora, otherwise known as the hyacinth lilac. And the Hyacinthiflora lilacs tend to tolerate warmer temperatures than the common vulgaris lilac, and they grow better in zones 7 and 8. And I think Washington, D.C., aren't you in a zone 7 or so?
Yep, definitely zone 7 with some areas actually of 8.
Right. So if I were starting off a lilac collection in that zone, the Hyacinthiflora common lilacs would be the ones I would prefer to plant. They don't tolerate a late frost quite as well, but late frosts tend to be more common in zones 5 and 6 than they are in 7 and 8 in terms of development.
Good to know. And are there many new varieties being introduced?
There are lots of Hyacinthiflora out there. Obviously not as many as the common vulgaris lilacs, but there are quite a few, and we can talk about varieties of lilacs that you might want to look for whenever you want to.
Great. So we'll circle back to that. But first I wanted to bring up you said there were 7 recognized colors of lilac flowers, and I think that's so interesting because lilac itself is a color.
It is, and it's one of the 7 colors. So yes, we established formally 7 colors in the lilac community in 1953 when John Wister established the first register of lilac cultivar names, and he assigned Roman numerals 1 through 7 to the 7 colors. So it's pretty reflexive for me to talk about them, but number 1 is always the white lilacs, and the common everyday lilac comes in lilac and white colors. So that one's pretty easy to remember. Number 1 is the white lilacs. Number 2 are the violets, a particular favorite of mine. They have a little bit of a bluish tinge. And then the number 3 is the bluish lilacs, light blue to darker blue, and some purplish tinge ones in there too. But the blues, probably a little rarer than many of the others. Finally, number 4 are the lilac-colored lilacs, the traditional color of the common lilac. Number 5 are the pink lilacs, so delicate and beautiful, and they go really well with the purple and blue colors. Number 6 are the so-called magenta that have more of a touch of red to their purplishness than anything else. And 7 are probably the most popular color, which is the purple lilacs, kind of a purplish lilac with a little magenta thrown in for most of them.
And all beautiful. So let's talk about best growing practices for lilacs. So say I want to grow my first lilac shrub. I go to my local garden center and I pick out maybe a 5-gallon plant or something to bring home. What's my next step?
Well, obviously you want to plant it in the spring or the fall. If you're going to plant it in the spring, just know that for the first year or 2, depending on the size of the plant, you're going to need to give it an inch of water a week. Once it's established, after a year or 2, depending again on size, it has no further water requirements than what comes naturally to the area anywhere in the eastern United States, in the proper zones, of course. So think about that and think about its proximity to water before you go planting it, and how you're going to water it during the drought times in July and August that we might encounter. It doesn't need watering if you get good rain in a week, but that first few years it does. In general, lilacs have pretty shallow roots, so they will need that water. Then, of course, you're going to have to dig your hole, and there's nothing special about that. Everybody knows that you dig a hole that's generally twice as wide as the root ball that you're planting. It doesn't need to be extraordinarily deep. Right where the roots come off is where you want to put it in the ground. But if you got clay soil, clay doesn't drain very well. And lilacs need good drainage. One of the reasons they need to be watered when they're establishing their roots. So you're going to have to amend clay soil in some manner, and there are many ways to amend soil. I'm sure you've talked about that many times in your podcasts. Compost being one of the primary ones. Anything that helps it drain better. So mixing that up is a good idea. So I always think about the soil with it, and people wonder about fertilizer. In general, lilacs don't need fertilizer. They tend to do best without fertilizer. And you certainly don't want to give them nitrogen-heavy fertilizer because nitrogen supports leaf growth, and you're really not looking to display the leaves. You're looking to display the flowers. So I don't usually put much down, maybe a little bit of Osmocote for the planting time, something that'll dissolve over 6 months or so, nothing that dissolves right away that might tend to burn the roots. And then every 2 or 3 years, I might throw a handful of 10-10-10 fertilizer on them. But again, it's probably not necessary. And all of this should depend a little bit on what your soil is like. And how do you find that out? Soil tests. Soil tests are so easy to do these days. Extension offices have little kits available for you. You can get some in stores. You can get them online. You send them into labs. They're not very expensive, and you know exactly what you have. You know what your soil pH is. You know what your nutrient deficiencies are. And I would rather go on the results of a soil test than anything else in determining whether I need to add a little lime to my acid soil or bring down the pH a little bit. Because in general, lilacs like neutral to alkaline soil. And acid soil is probably a lot more common in your neck of the woods than it is in mine. We tend to have about a 7.2, 7.3 pH here in mid-Ohio. But that's not true in the eastern coastal plains where a lot of nutrients have washed out. Clay is great for holding on to nutrients, but draining soils tend to need supplemental nutrients a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the advice I would give when you're planting lilacs is I plant mine a little high, just like a little bit above the soil level for the root crown.
So they don't get wet feet, right?
Exactly, in that clay soil here, because I would hate to do the opposite. Kind of create that indent around it that I see some people do, and then they'll hose it in like a big donut of water around it, and I'm like, that's not going to do well.
Yeah, thank you very much for making that point. Their natural habitat tends to be mountainsides and the slopes going down into rivers, so they love good drainage. Mine are planted on a rather steep hill, and they do love that. They don't tolerate water-soaked roots, so you got to make sure that if you've got a low spot, you're going to have to raise them up.
And I bet on those mountainsides, it's in full sun. So really, I don't find blooming to be very well on any of the lilacs unless it is literally full sun all day.
Yes, we'll say a minimum of 6 hours of sun each day, and the more the merrier for lilac.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who have a lot of infill trees. As your garden matures, it fills out, and they're getting shading over their lilacs. And of course, the blooms are declining.
That's exactly what happens to yards as they mature, and those lilacs basically need to be moved if you can't move the trees.
And would you say, if you can't trim back the trees, of course, that it's fairly easy to move a mature lilac? Would you cut it back severely and root prune it before you moved it?
So it's never easy to move a mature shrub of any kind. But if I were rating them, lilacs would be one of the easier ones to move. In general, when I do that, I do cut them back to about a 3-foot height in general. I dig up as much of the root ball as possible, and they tend to be shallower root balls, so it's not a horrible, terrible job to do that. And I do not prune the roots at all. I leave everything attached, and I will plant it just like I dig it up.
Well, that brings us to the biggest question I always get about lilacs, Mark, and I'm sure you get this a lot too, which is when to prune, how much to prune, and does it need to be done annually?
Well, I'll tell you, I have 180 of them in ground in my backyard, and I am in my mid-70s, and there is no way I can prune 180 lilacs every year. So I do the necessities, and let's talk about the necessities. There's really 2 times that you can prune lilacs. The first time is immediately after they finish flowering. As soon as the flowers are 95% gone, and within a week or 2 afterwards is when you can prune them. The reason for that is that the new growth during the summer is where the new flowers are going to be on the following year. So if you prune them before that new growth happens, they'll still have a chance to set their flowers that same year for blooming the next year. But if you decide to wait or you can't get to them soon enough and you prune them in July or August, you are cutting off next year's flowers and you won't have any blooms the following year. So a lot of people are surprised when they don't get blooms, say, what happened? I take good care of it. I prune it every year. And well, they pruned it at the wrong time. So that's for size and symmetry if people like to do that. But there's another time to prune lilacs, and that's in winter. And that's more of a rejuvenation pruning or cutting out undesirable crossing branches, keeping it to size. And the way that'll work is you generally will want to prune off the biggest and oldest stems coming up from the ground, if this is a common lilac, by the way. And that will then have other sprouts coming from its base. So I usually only go down to about the 6 to 12 inch mark when I'm doing that. And then more shoots will come off the base. And in 3 to 5 years, those shoots will produce flowers as well. So that's an easy way to start rejuvenating an old lilac that's gotten overgrown, isn't flowering as much anymore. We'll say that you should go in and prune out about a third of the oldest, biggest canes, those over 2 inches, let's say, and let sprouts start happening from its base. And each year for the next couple of years, you prune out a third more. And by the 4th year, those first ones that you did are going to start flowering, and more are going to come in each succeeding year after that. And so you're never without your flowers when you're doing rejuvenation in that particular manner.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Groundcover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Groundcover Revolution is here with you all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Groundcover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Groundcover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
I noticed a lot of the lilacs like to make suckers. Do you recommend taking a portion of them out, leaving some?
Well, suckers are a mixed blessing, and the official horticultural name for them would be more like offshoots, but I call them suckers too. Suckers are the way common lilacs rejuvenate themselves. And if you get too old of a lilac, it's going to occasionally break off. The flowering won't be as much, and the flowers will be too high for you to see, smell, and appreciate. What's the use of a flower that's 20 feet high above you? So if you want to bring down the level of it a little bit, you're going to want to leave those suckers there and let them start sprouting. And in 4 or 5 years, they're going to start producing flowers. So that's the blessing of common lilacs that sucker. It also means that they'll tend to spread out more, and if you don't want them to spread out, then you're going to have to lop off those suckers as they grow. Other types of lilacs, the little leaves, tend to have that kind of growth pattern as well. The late lilacs do not. They tend to have a single main trunk that gets many, many shoots coming off the very base, that if you look at it closely, you'll see they're not really coming off of roots far out from the main base. And so you're going to probably want to leave those alone for fear of damaging the main stem and trunk as well.
And I was just thinking, the other most common question I get here in the Mid-Atlantic about lilacs is the look of the foliage in late summer is not the most attractive. Let's just admit that. It can kind of get mildewy looking and drop, and people will think that their lilac is dying.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. It's a problem with the lilacs, and they are not the most gorgeous shrub late in the summer. And that's because they are prone to fungal and bacterial diseases of their leaves. Remember, they're not native to North America. So they get powdery mildew, and they get pseudocercospora and pseudomonas and various other diseases of their leaves. The leaves start turning brown. Some will start falling off. On occasion, you'll even see all the leaves fall off of a lilac in late summer. But I can tell you that it doesn't really affect the vigor or longevity of most common lilacs. And it is common lilacs that are most affected by those leaf diseases. It is possible to treat those diseases and prevent them, but it's a fairly intensive amount of work once a week. And obviously with 180 lilacs, I don't do that. I let nature take its course. But here's some more good news. People are breeding lilacs to become resistant to many of those diseases. Powdery mildew is kind of unsightly, the white fungus that coats the leaves. It can be pretty easily prevented by spraying dormant horticultural oil or neem oil on those leaves once a week, starting in late spring. And that's pretty labor intensive. But there are some newer ones coming out that are resistant to powdery mildew. And there are some old ones that we are learning are resistant to it and other leaf diseases as well. So you can start looking for those kinds of lilacs. That information is not generally available on the internet, but it is available in publications of the International Lilac Society.
That's good to hear. And yes, don't panic if your lilacs in late summer the leaves turn brown or all drop off. It's not dead or dying. It's just going through. No. And you'll get the flowers next year, which is always good. It's just a little unsightly. And as you say, we have some new varieties coming on the horizon. So maybe it's a good time to explore now the best varieties for our region, and then some of those new varieties might be coming.
Well, let me add to that then that the Hyacinthiflora that we talked about earlier are pretty resistant to a lot of these diseases, more so than the common lilac itself. So if you want to avoid some of that unsightliness of the leaves in late summer, the Hyacinthiflora would be your first choice. They're also the ones that get some good autumn color. Common lilacs do not get good autumn color, but the Hyacinthiflora do because one of their parents, the oblatas, have excellent fall color over in China. So fall color is an attraction of the Hyacinthiflora as well. So let's talk about the Hyacinthiflora. What are your best cultivars? Well, there's a lot of great cultivars that are rare and that are pretty much shared among collectors but not available to the general public. But the ones that are available, here's the ones that I would recommend. Probably my favorite Hyacinthiflora is one called Evangeline. It's usually the first Hyacinthiflora to bloom every spring. It doesn't get terribly tall, 10 feet, I would say, for most of them. And it has a gorgeous flower, a gorgeous scent, very resistant to disease, and just is a fabulous cultivar for Hyacinthiflora. So put that big on your list. The other ones that are new out there right now are called the New Age Lilacs, appropriately enough. And they've been bred by Rick Rosini to be resistant to powdery mildew. They come currently in a white and lavender color. There's a new one that's coming out called Pink Flush that probably isn't going to be generally available for another year. But you can find these New Age lilacs in many different places, and they are quite resistant to a lot of diseases, particularly powdery mildew. A couple others. Declaration is one that I would recommend, along with Betsy Ross. These two were developed in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. National Arboretum by Donald Egoff and some of his collaborators. And they were developed patent-free and are freely available and copyable by anybody. So they're called Declaration and Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross is a white, and Declaration is kind of a magenta purple, and they are both wonderful, wonderful lilacs. I enjoy them very much. There's one lilac that's out now. There's a series called Centara. I don't recommend all the Centaras, but one I highly recommend is one called Centara Double Blue. And again, that's its trademark name. Easily found in the retail market and very showy and one of the rarer double blues. We haven't talked much about the flowers, Kathy, but people should know that the flowers come in two forms, single and double. So the singles have 4 petals and the doubles will have 8 petals. And there's a different look to them completely. And some people like the single look and some people like the double look. And then there's people like me who like both looks. Mm-hmm. So either one works for me. The warmer climates, particularly if we're talking zone 8, should look into some lilacs with the trademark name Beach Party. They were discovered out in the LA area. The two names to know are Rosy and Snowy. Snowy, of course, is a white, and Rosy is more of a pinkish purple. And they tolerate warm temperatures the best out of all of the Hyacinthiflora and common lilacs. And they'll still bloom, and they do bloom out in Los Angeles in Zone 9 in certain well-cared-for areas. So that's a list of my favorite Hyacinthiflora, early blooming ones, especially the ones that would be great in the DC area.
Yeah, and I think in my collection I have Maiden's Blush, which is, again, a Hyacinthiflora and very pale. Yeah, very pale.
It's a nice pink, and it's got a great form to the florets. And I do highly recommend Maiden's Blush as well.
And that you have explained to me today why it blooms 2 weeks before the other common lilac I have in all these years. Yeah,
the Hyacinthifloras bloom a little earlier. They're a hybrid with that earliest called Oblata.
Yes, and that's great to know because they were given to me both as common lilacs. They were started from propagation, and we could talk a little bit about propagating now and passing along lilacs.
Well, that's a great topic and a complicated one. Up until probably 40 years ago, lilacs were propagated, passed on, and planted as grafted specimens. It's a lot easier to get grafted specimens compared to any other method of propagation. But the problem, of course, is that grafts eventually fail. One of the ways to overcome that is to plant a grafted lilac below the soil line where the graft is, and then the rootstock tends to die out and it sprouts new roots from the grafted scion variety. But that fell out of favor because of the failure of rootstocks and the grafts. And what you ended up with is the top part that's desirable was grafted, but it died out, and then the rootstock, which might be a common lilac and not as pretty, would take over, and people thought, oh, this cultivar is not very pretty. Well, that's because the cultivar is dead, and you're looking at the rootstock. So it fell out of favor, and today, almost nobody sells grafted lilacs. They're all own root lilac cultivars. So how do you get an own root lilac cultivar? Well, you don't get them from seeds. Like many other types of shrubs, seeds are hybrids of both parents. And if we have your favorite maiden's blush there and we allow it to go produce seeds, well, it's being seeded by some other lilac that we don't know about, probably a common lilac. And the seeds that are produced are not maiden's blush. They are something else. And the odds are about 1 in 1,000 that that something else would be desirable. So people that plant seeds in hopes of getting a great cultivar have to be willing to plant thousands and thousands of seeds, evaluate thousands of plants for 5 or 10 years before they find that one that might be a future great cultivar. I really don't recommend that for the hobbyist or the home gardener.
No.
So forget about planting seeds of lilacs. Nobody does that unless they're a big-time nursery or researcher or breeder. Instead, you have to reproduce desirable cultivars by taking suckers from their roots, which involve taking the roots themselves as well as the sucker that's showing above the line of soil. So you get one plant that way, and of course have to grow it up to growing size and flowering size. And the other way would be to take a cutting and root it. So the topic of rooting cuttings in lilacs is an extremely complex one and a difficult one to talk about. But here's the summary. It is possible to root lilacs, which is not true for many things. My other interest is pawpaws, and nobody has successfully rooted pawpaw cuttings yet. We're still looking to figure out a way to do that. But we can root lilac cuttings, but the common lilac is the least successful at getting rooted. A standard success rate is about 10%. So if you plant 10 lilac cultivars, about one of them may succeed in developing roots and living on. We're a little more successful with late lilacs and little leaf lilacs. Most people are in about the 25% range for them, but we're learning better and better how to do this. And there are some places that are getting up to 50% common lilac rooting and up to 80 or 90% for little leaf and late lilac rooting. So the ways you do that, we can talk about if you like, but it can be done by a home gardener, and I'm happy to share that.
Sure, let's go into that and maybe best timing for doing that.
Sure. The time to take your cuttings is in the spring, late spring, with new growth. So generally, the earlier the better, because that's when the cells in the new cuttings, the new growth, are developing the fastest and are more likely to want to develop roots. The cuttings come from this year's growth. Usually I take about a 4 to 6 inch cutting. Green tips are the best. You want to avoid woody stems, which do not develop roots very well. But you need it to have a little substance so it doesn't fall over as the newest green shoots tend to do. So most of the time, May and even through June is the time to take your cuttings. They have to be put into some extremely draining soil. They can't be steeped in water at all. And that means for most of us, we put them in pots, and those pots are going to be filled with whatever easy draining material you want, perlite, vermiculite, even sand, anything that drains easily. But here's the key. The parts above the soil or the potting medium have to be kept wet. That's the stem and the leaves. And you're going to leave 2 to 4 leaves on this cutting. And you somehow have to keep that moist all the time. So commercially, they have misting sprayers that keep a very high humidity level in the greenhouse, but most of us can't do that. So I originally set up a little tent over my cuttings and had a timer on for lilac misters in there, and it was difficult to do and not terribly successful. So what I do now is I have individual pots where I put 2 to 4 cuttings into the potting medium, and I spray them with water, and then I cover them with a dome, usually a vented dome, but I like the ones that have little adjusters on the top where you can close it up or open up a few vent holes so I can adjust the humidity in them. but they have to be kept constantly moist all the time they're trying to set roots. It'll take those roots 2 to 3 months to develop before you can consider taking it out of that humidity dome and putting it into a regular pot of good draining soil. So it can be very rewarding. It's very exciting to be able to reproduce rare lilacs that way. There's absolutely no reason to try and reproduce a common lilac that way, because common lilacs are easily available and can be bought in bulk already rooted as cutting.
And as you described, just taking some of the suckers and digging those out with their roots is probably the easiest way.
It is by far the easiest way.
And or buying one from your local independent garden center or from a specialty nursery. Do you have any favorite sources?
So online is fine as long as you're doing a reputable nursery. I would never buy a named lilac from a big box store. I won't name names, but everybody knows what big box stores are. What they sell as a named cultivar is rarely reliable and often wrong. And that is a big problem in our industry, people having named cultivars that turn out to be wrong. My preference is to buy from a specialty lilac nursery, but there are very, very few of those. In my opinion, the best one is Hope Springs Nursery in New York. The lady that runs that has been doing it for quite a few years, but she is getting to the stage of life where she may only be doing it for another year or two. And she has a great selection. All of them are true to name. You can rely on what she sells you, and she does it in a very beautiful and caring way in terms of shipping them to you. So get them before they're gone.
Good to know. And yes, take advantage of that source now while we can. And I would imagine, as you mentioned with the International Lilac Society and their auctions, being a member gets you access to lots of different ones that aren't necessarily available on the market.
Yes, the ILS auction is primarily for rarer lilacs, particularly for collectors that like to buy them. But we have common ones sold there as well. They range from a minimum of $10. I think our record auction price last year was $950 for the very first flowering lilac of a rare Russian variety that's first time in this country. So they are a wide range of prices. And here's a little secret. You don't have to be a member of the Lilac Society to bid on a lilac at the ILS auction each year. This year, the auction will be at our annual convention, May 4th and 5th in Akron, Ohio, Kent, Ohio area.
Good to know. And let's look towards the future of lilacs. So I'm imagining a lot of the breeding is for heat and humidity resistance, but also maybe some fun things like variegated foliage.
So I think size and variegated foliage are probably the two that are most interesting. Size is the current buzzword. People have smaller yards, smaller gardens, and they can't afford to plant a 20-foot high lilac necessarily. So they want something that fits in their garden a little more, and the breeders are certainly working on that. Probably the best known person doing that would be Tim Wood at Spring Meadow Nursery, or I think it's Great Garden Plants for its retail. Proven Winners. They have the Proven Winners franchise for shrubs, and they do lilacs, and they're breeding them for size as well as disease resistance. So their Bloomerang series is probably the best known. Their lilacs range from 3 to 5 feet in high in that series. Most of them, a few of them are larger than that, but they're a good choice. And they're also being bred not just because of size, but also because of reblooming. So we should talk about reblooming, Kathy.
Definitely.
Reblooming is an issue right now, and I'll tell you why. The only lilacs that truly rebloom are the little leaf lilacs, which, by the way, are the Bloomerang lilacs. They are little leaf lilacs, not common lilacs. The little leaves tend to have smaller flowers and smaller panicles, but they tend to have more of them profusely covering the plant. They also tend to be a smaller plant, so that's good. They will rebloom on new growth during the summer. True reblooming is called remontancy, and it is a difficult thing to achieve. In lilacs, it seems to occur best in cool weather. So if you're zone 3, 4, or 5, you're going to see a fair amount of good remontancy or reblooming in these little leaf lilacs that are being particularly bred for it. But if you're in zone 6 and above, it tends to be a pretty sparse, poor rebloom. It does exist. You can see it. You can actually get a little smell, but it's nothing spectacular and nothing like the first bloom that you see in spring. Probably if it's going to be the best rebloom, it'll be in the cooler month in September as things start to cool off a little bit. So I personally wouldn't buy a lilac for reblooming unless I live in zone 5 or lower.
Yeah, I'm trialing a few of the Bloomerang collection from the Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs collection, and I found that same thing, that it's mainly sporadic blooming in spring and then again in the fall. But I have been able to cut some, Mark, and have them in a vase, and they're nice long lasting flowers in a vase, and as you said, they bloom on new growth, so taking some of the cuttings for that purpose in the spring hasn't hurt the shrub at all.
That is absolutely true. You can do that. But here's something to be careful of. People think common lilacs rebloom because sometimes they see it bloom in August or September or even October. And here's the problem. If you see a common lilac blooming at that time, that means that lilac is under great stress, usually due to drought or heat. And that flower that you see blooming is one that was supposed to bloom the next spring. So that means it's decreasing its bloom the following spring because it thinks it's going to die with the drought and the heat, and it wants to reproduce as quickly as possible. So it's not true reblooming. It's a sign of a stressed out lilac, and you really don't want that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Mark, and something to look out for, especially after last summer's heat and drought here in the Mid-Atlantic. I did see sporadic reblooming on many of those common lilacs.
We have the same thing here in Ohio, and that's not desirable at all. And then you mentioned variegation. There are almost no lilacs available with variegation. That's not true of other shrubs and perennials and flowers where variegation has become very desirable, and there are reasons for that. So there is one common lilac that you might be able to find online at the store that features variegation. It's called, unfortunately, Ocubaefolia, old Latin name. It's been around since about 1905, and it has gorgeous variegated foliage and a double blue flower. So it's really a very nice lilac. It's very vigorous, and it can be found in the trade, but that's probably about the only one that you're going to see out there. And that's because variegation is generally a sign of a less vigorous plant that needs more sun. And of course, lilacs need sun in the first place. So lilac breeders over the last 100 years or so have pruned out variegated lilacs as being less vigorous and undesirable. They didn't realize they would someday become visually desirable to we home gardeners.
And trendy.
Trendy indeed. So variegated lilacs do exist, but they haven't been around very long, and they haven't been developed as named cultivars with great blooms. So it's pretty hard to find them, and the very few that exist are pretty rare with the exception of Ocubaefolia.
Well, in our last little bit of time, let's talk about deer and rabbits. And I think I have found my lilacs to be pretty resistant. What is the general consensus on that, Mark?
So we'll say they have some mild sensitivity to deer. Deer will eat lilac leaves, but only if nothing else is available.
Mm-hmm.
They will rub their antlers on lilac bark and break off branches as they grab leaves. So deer will bother lilacs, but not if they have other things available. They much prefer my hostas over my lilacs, I can assure you. I plant lots of hostas, so they'll eat those instead of my lilacs. Rabbits, moles, vice, they'll tend to nibble at the bark at the base of lilacs, particularly in winter. Those of you who are lucky enough to have snow cover all winter long might see that damage underneath the snow. But in general, they haven't been a problem for me where I don't have snow cover. They have other things that they can eat on.
Mm-hmm. And we like to go looking at lilacs, experiencing lilacs when they're in the height of season. So we talked about the U.S. National Arboretum's breeding program that you touched on, Mark, but there is actually a collection for Washington, D.C. residents to go and visit there.
There is, and it's not labeled in general, and it is a research collection, so they don't feature it, but it is a beautiful collection. I've been there, and it's great to go see. It blooms at the same time as their wonderful azalea and rhododendron collection in the woods there. So if you go to see one, go see the other. There are some other ones in the DC area, and I'm actually making a trip in another month to go see these, which are among the last collections I have never seen. Over in the Philly area, you've got lilac collections at the Mount Cuba Center, the Tyler Arboretum, Barnes Arboretum, Scott Arboretum, Morris Arboretum, and not far away in New Jersey, the Willowwood Arboretum and the New Jersey Botanical Garden at Skylands all have excellent collections, and that's where I'm off to this spring.
Wonderful. And of course, there is the annual Rochester Lilac Festival, and I have not yet been to that, but I'm imagining you have, Mark.
Oh, absolutely. Almost every year, the number 4 flower festival in the country at Highland Park in Rochester with the world's largest collection of lilacs, over 1,100 shrubs featured there with probably 500 different cultivars. I go almost every year, and it is a sight for the eyes and the nose.
Can imagine. And I've seen photos. I went and visited the Rochester Visit website, and I cannot wait to make plans to go up there.
Another one you should think about is the number 3 flower festival in the country, which is the Mackinac Island Lilac Festival. And the cool thing about that one is it's in June when every other place is done with their blooming lilacs. Mackinac probably has the last blooming lilac collection in the country every year. So very fun to go up there in June.
It sounds like a great plan is to follow the lilacs as they bloom going northward.
That is absolutely the way I do it.
Any final advice on lilac growing, Mark?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing your passion for lilacs and your expertise. And I am definitely going to be checking out some of those local collections as they come into bloom this spring. Thank you again, Mark.
Enjoy, Kathy.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Teri Speight, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Trout lily, plant profile. Trout lily, Erythronium americanum, is a perennial spring ephemeral plant that is native to eastern North America. It has pretty yellow or white flowers that dangle at the top of a 6 to 8 inch high stem. The foliage is mottled and resembles the brown coloring of a trout. It is also known as fawn lily, woodland glory, yellow adder's tongue, or yellow dogtooth violet. It prefers to grow in moist, acidic soils under deciduous shade trees. It will form a colony where it is happy. It's hardy to USDA zones 3 to 9. The trout lily provides pollen and nectar to early season native bees, like the mason bees and queen bumblebees. Trout lilies are generally deer and rabbit resistant. They can be most easily propagated by digging a clump and dividing it, but they can also be grown from seed or bulb offset. The plant is a healing herb that was used in wound care by the Native Americans. Trout lily, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, my minor bulbs, like the grape hyacinth, scilla, and pushkinia, are all blooming. Over in the community garden plot, we had our first asparagus. In the garden tips we shared this week, we noted that the hummingbirds are coming back sooner than you think. Have your feeders ready for them by tracking them on the map at Hummingbird Central. We noted on the map that they are already as far north as Newport News, Virginia this week. In other news and events, it is the Cherry Blossom Festival time in Washington, D.C., and we shared our 17-plus cherry blossom viewing alternatives in the D.C. region on our blog at washingtongardener.blogspot.com. We've updated it for 2025, so do go and check that out if you are interested in cherry blossoms. And our March 2025 issue of Washington Gardener magazine is out. It is our 20th anniversary issue, and wanted to note as well that this is the 5th anniversary of the GardenDC podcast. In that magazine issue, you can find out about Persian buttercup, catching up on some of our past profile subjects. We cover the U.S. Botanic Gardens Orchids Masters of Deception exhibit. We are celebrating tulip time. We share profiles of red-winged blackbirds and early spring native plants. And there's an essay on how gardening changed my life, amongst many other features. You can check that out at our blog at washingtongardener.blogspot.com. And I urge you to subscribe today. In local gardening events, David Culp, plants person and friend of the GardenDC podcast, has been added to the American Horticultural Society's annual spring garden market at River Farm. He will be speaking twice during that event, and that takes place April 11th and 12th at River Farm in Alexandria, Virginia. There will be 30-plus plant retailers and artisanal vendors and more, and you can find out more about that at ahsgardening.org/spring-garden-market. And Saturday, April 19th from 12 to 3, there will be a seedling sale, seed and plant swap, and community care at Common Good City Farm in Washington, D.C. There'll be free and delicious food and seed-inspired dishes. They'd love to have you RSVP for the event on Eventbrite, and you can find out more at the Common Good City Farm website. And then I'll be participating in a book event on Tuesday, April 22nd at 7 p.m. And this is taking place at Wonderland Books in downtown Bethesda, Maryland. And I will be interviewing Paula Wyman, the author of Bad Naturalist, another past guest on the GardenDC podcast. And that book event you can attend for free, and that's at wonderlandbooks.com for more details all about that. And finally, I want to let you know about the upcoming garden fair at the Blandy Experimental Farm in Boyce, Virginia. That's the State Arboretum of Virginia. Is taking place this year on May 10th and 11th. That's Mother's Day weekend, and you can make plans for that and find out details at blandy.virginia.edu. Happy gardening! The last word on the lilac in Nosferatu. Symbolism of lilacs and death. Do you swoon at the scent of lilacs? It's a favorite floral scent for many, and a flowering shrub that others cherish for their childhood memories of smelling it in an older relative's garden. The lilac takes on a symbolic life of its own in the updated horror film Nosferatu that came out in December 2024. It's a remake of the 1922 classic horror film, which itself was based, completely ripped off, the Dracula novel by Bram Stoker. Warning, this newer film version is gruesome and hard to watch for many in sections. It's definitely not for everyone. In an early scene in the film, the young, newly married Thomas Hutter runs home in the driving rain with his hat covering a huge bouquet of cut lilacs for his new bride, Ellen. He's not a rich man, so this is quite an extravagant gesture and meant to make up for the fact that he will soon be taking a long work trip away from her. When she receives them, she screams in anguish and claims that the flowers are a waste and that they will all soon die. I've always found people who make this statement to be churlish and ignorant. It really is a silly assertion, given that the lilac's flower's vase life indoors is virtually the same as it is on the plant itself, about 1 to 2 weeks. So why not go ahead and cut some to enjoy while they last? The lilac is native to Eastern Europe, so it's no wonder Count Orlok is drawn to them, since they would have reminded him of the springtimes of his human youth. And that is where I have one serious issue with the movie, which takes place in 1838 during the weeks leading up to Christmas. How anyone of this time period would source a big bouquet of springtime flowers is a mystery. It's not a plant that can be forced into bloom prior to February or March, nor does it grow in southern locations where it could be imported from, because lilacs need a cold winter to set their flower buds. Lilac, the color itself, which was named after the flower, is associated with youth and purity. In the film, Ellen wears a lilac dress and cloak and some faux lilacs in her hair. She also cuts the end of her hair and puts it into a locket for Thomas on his travels. Spoiler alert, this locket is grabbed by Count Orlok and he smells the hair in it, mentioning the scent of lilacs. According to loveflowers.co, lilacs symbolize renewal and the promise of new beginnings, as they are among the first flowers to bloom in springtime. This makes them a wonderful representation of rebirth and growth. In Victorian England, lilacs were also a symbol of love and remembrance, often given to loved ones as a sign of devotion. The lilac's use in funerals is described by the Schilling Funeral Home as a common choice for funeral memorial tributes of a young person or someone who had childlike nature or a good heart. With its signature floral scent and its youthful appearance, lilacs signify purity and innocence. They are often brought to funerals and memorials to represent the idea that the deceased soul has become peaceful and innocent in death, or that the deceased will be reborn into a new life. Spoiler alert, this funereal use of lilacs is apropos for strewing around Ellen's body after her sacrifice at the end of the film and being robbed of her innocent youth. Moreover, it's likely helped to combat the putrid smell of the Count's shriveled corpse that's lying next to her. Lilacs have many other layers of meanings. American folklore recommends them for warding off evil spirits, and the Victorians associated with them with old love and remembrance, as the shrubs are long-lived, often lasting a century or more in the garden. They were not associated with death until the springtime funeral of Abraham Lincoln. Smell is the most evocative of scents and can bring a person right back to the significant time and place where they first had that fragrance. In the case of lilacs, Walt Whitman wrote of Lincoln's passing, "I find myself always reminded of great tragedy of that day by the sight and odor of these blossoms. It never fails." Melissa Gowdy writes, "The scent of lilacs is what he associated with his grief, and he immortalized that in the eulogy poem about the death of President Abraham Lincoln, when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed." Interestingly, the smell of lilacs releases the organic chemical compound indole, which is present in both feces and flowers. A Johns Hopkins University blog post explains, lilacs can smell fresh at first and then quickly thereafter decayed and rotten, tempering the promise of spring with the indolic hint of decay and desolation. The film Nosferatu aims to do the same with its haunting story and stunning imagery that linger in one's mind far after the film has been viewed. Indolic indeed. Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.